You are listening to MyHRBuzz, brought to you by MyHRConcierge. Hosted by Chris Cooley, we'll bring you various topics and guests to shed light on the often confusing world of HR and also employee screening. We'll be putting the human in human resources.
I want to thank you for joining us today. I believe we have a great topic. We're going to talk about handbooks today, which is something that every business needs. And we have Emily Frederick joining us today with MyHRConcierge. She's our senior HR consultant and handbook guru. So I appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we're recording this, it's end of October, almost November. And so we're kind of getting upon the end of the year, which is a great time to look at your handbook, review your handbook, and kind of get it right for the new year, new regulations, those kind of things. So kind of if we step back a little bit, Emily, what is a handbook and what is its role?
A handbook is a lot of different things. It's mainly the document that a company needs to use to outline its policies, procedures, employee rights as they relate to non-discrimination, non-harassment, things like that. It should also be a company culture document. So it should be customized, specific to a company. It should have their mission, their values, things like that in it. But the main thing is that it's really there for an employee's rights, and you need to be sure that, managers understand what's in there and what is not in there, things like that.
Yeah. And I think that's important. You mentioned like culture. And so many times we talk to people and they say, well, it's just a book of rules.
Mm-hmm.
It's really so much more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the company really has that opportunity to explain who they are to their employees, and let them know these are the kinds of things that as a company we'll be working towards together. And then these are the kinds of things that are not acceptable here. So it's a good communication document.
Yeah. And it's interesting because we do work with so many people. We do a ton of these handbooks, and a lot of them, as we're reviewing them, are so different. We get the ones that have the funny pictures and the colors and the fonts and all those kind of things. And then we have those that it's just black and white.
Yeah.
And again, it just fits their culture, and it's kind of the way they operate, and they're all kind of living documents and different and those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's really interesting to kind of see those dynamics between businesses. All right, so we create the handbook. Why is it so important that we get the handbook updated?
So the handbook has to be up to date with current federal and state laws, because at the end of the day, it's going to be a legal reference point for both the employees and the employers in case there's any sort of dispute. It's able to provide evidence of the company's established policies and show that those policies are applied uniformly across all employees. It's really important for things like unemployment claims. So if an employee files an unemployment claim, the company is able to say, well, this is the reason they were terminated. They violated this policy, and here's evidence that we apply that policy uniformly. And, here's an acknowledgement that shows that the employee knew about this policy. And so that's one of the really important things.
Yeah, I know a lot of times, like in prior life, right? We had different issues that would pop up. Either there was a harassment suit or whatever it may be. And I know always one of the first things that's asked for is that handbook.
Mm-hmm.
Show me where your policy is. Show me how do you address it. Have you addressed it? Those kinds of things. And so, as we think about that, what should we include? So what are those kind of primary, I guess there's you have two things. You have what I would term more of the regulatory, these are just those things that we need to include. And then we also have those things that are more company specific, right?
Yeah.
And so what are those things that we need to make sure from a regulatory perspective that we have?
You know what? There are those things. First, I'm going to say what should not be in the handbook. So what it's very important, and that your handbook while it's going to be used as a legal reference point if an employer ever needs it, it is not a legally binding document. And that's really important to note, because if it were to be a legally binding document, then it might disrupt the at-will status of an employee. So you don't want to put things in there like NDAs or employment contracts, something like that the employee could accidentally be signing when they're signing the handbook acknowledgement. So in fact, it's really important to have something in there that says, this does not change the at-will status of our employee. Like, nothing in this handbook changes that. That's the first thing I want to say.
Yeah.
Then, yeah, absolutely. We have federal law compliance things that need to be addressed. Federal Fair Labor Standards Act, so FLSA things like minimum wage and overtime, how overtime is calculated, what hours in a day or in a week, because those laws vary by state, what hours count towards overtime. It's important to have leave policies, so the company specific leave policies, and then FMLA that needs to be addressed in a handbook. Anti-discrimination policies, your equal employment opportunity, and then any non-harassment policies. And then some companies will also need to include safety policies, OSHA standards, things like that.
Okay. And so with that, one thing I would think about too is we talk a lot about state requirements, but also which are states becoming so much more progressive now as it becomes to regulations, right? But also we've seen municipality. We see a lot of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. In some of the especially more progressive states, then we'll drill down to the county, the city. So yeah, different municipalities have their own special regulations and laws, special employee leaves, special minimum wage standards, things like that.
Yeah, because it's interesting. Overtime is not even overtime. It's not the same everywhere. Used to it was the same. It's calculated the same. But that's something that employers have to be really cognizant of, is even things like that. And really, the handbook to me is it needs to be updated, because it obviously you need to make sure that it's relevant and it has the latest regulations. But also it's a great way for employers to kind of refresh, to make sure that they do know what those laws are. And to make sure that they're staying abreast of those from an operating perspective, not just to put in their handbook, but just from a knowledge perspective.
For sure. That's actually something that comes up in a lot of our handbook reviews. I'll get a handbook in a state that has more details that go into its laws for the state or even the jurisdiction. And when I provide the update and say, well, this has to change. Now you have to, in your jurisdiction, you have to provide overtime payments for hours worked over 8 in a day, for, on the 7th day, there's more overtime, things like that in their area. And sometimes employers just had no idea that regulation had recently changed, or that was something that they should have been doing this entire time, because their handbook hadn't been updated in 5 years, and it's not something that they keep up with.
Yeah, I remember we had one group that through the process we figured out they had been in violation of wage and hour for like 20 years, in the way that they were doing overtime, and so. It's just a good way. Now, obviously, they fixed that and did whatever they needed to do it. But yeah, it's really a great way for that. So let me ask you this: what are we talked about the FLSA and the FMLA? What are other policies that we need to make sure that are included?
Just in general.
General. Yeah, just they may not be a specific law, if you will, but they're just good fundamental policies.
Absolutely. There are things that your employees need to be made aware of. So, for example, the company wants, in most cases, the company is going to want the right to inspect all of the property that's on the company, or that's all of the property that's on the company's property.
Right.
And so you'll need to let your employees know that they have no expectation of privacy where their workspaces are concerned. Or you might need to let employees know that there are, even if it's not a state requirement, that you have specific meal and break time policies. And that's the way that they're going to be communicated to employees, just so that there's not confusion among different managers or supervisors or employees themselves.
Okay. No, and that makes sense. And so we talk about those, and we talked about we don't need non-competes, we don't need drug testing policies, those kind of things, because specifically from a legal perspective, I know what as we work with legal counsel, they've told us those need to be signed specifically so that there cannot ever be any ambiguity on whether they read it or not. Right?
Absolutely.
Got a document here that missed. So what are some other things? What are other things that people need to maybe not include? I know when I talk to a lot of employers, they have basically how to run the entire company in their handbook. It's huge, it's large, it's cumbersome. What are and then typically I'll try to explain to them, hey, this is generally in another document. So what are things that you generally don't include in an employee handbook?
No, you're exactly right. We wouldn't want to see detailed procedures. So, step-by-step instructions on something like how to turn in your time for the week. That doesn't need to be in there. It's going to be skimmed over. First of all, it's not going to be read. And then when there are enough of those types of policies, then the employee's just not going to read the handbook at all. And like you said, it becomes too cumbersome. It becomes too long for an employee to understand it. We wouldn't want to see anything that's project related or temporary in a handbook. Even if it's a temporary policies should be sent out as memos, and they shouldn't be put into place in the handbook, for all eternity. We wouldn't want to see detailed benefit information. A lot of companies change their benefits at open enrollment every single year. And so you wouldn't, if you did that and benefits changed, you would need to make sure that they were changed in the handbook every single update, and that gets cumbersome. Okay. And you wouldn't want employees to have incorrect information. And so rather what you would want to do is say all of your benefit information is updated annually in a guide, and you can find this guide in this separate place. And then it's really important that there's nothing discriminatory that's included in any of the policies. It's over the last few years, we've seen a lot of changes nationwide on what can be considered discriminatory. And now what I'm finding a lot is that old dress and appearance policies, old dress codes, they need to be updated because they do have some discriminatory language in them. So, for example, Illinois has the Crown Act, which specifically states that an employer cannot put a ban on hairstyles because different hairstyles are better for different cultures, different nationalities. And for an employer to make a statement that some hairstyles are not considered professional is entirely discriminatory. And so we wouldn't want to see anything like that.
Okay, that makes sense. So especially, I run into so many companies that won't benefit information in there. And I mean, to me, it would be easier, and what we've always done too, but is to have that in that separate document. It's just a summary of their benefits that they can hand out as they go through open enrollment. They're not handing out handbooks. It just seems like that would be so much simpler. And also, for those things that are updated, I mean, if you think about these handbooks, specifically if you have a large number of people, depending on how you distribute those, I mean, it can get pretty cumbersome. By the time you get the authorization forms, even if you have an HRIS system that you do it through, you got to communicate, you got to get them to do it, you got to track it. And if you have 100 people, there's going to be 20 of them that you got to beg, plead, and kick in the rear to do it, right?
Yeah.
And so, so for those things, I definitely agree that it's better just to leave those out, because the less you have to update and redistribute, the better.
Yes. And Another thing is, like, you really want to pay attention to how long the handbook is. And so when you're piling all of these separate documents, procedures, benefits information, all of this, your handbook winds up being hundreds of pages long, and no employee is ever going to read hundreds of pages of legalese or anything like that. And then that works against the employer. So if there were to be an issue in court, the court's going to want to know if the handbook was easily accessible, if it had been distributed, and then if it was easy to understand for the employee. And if it's not, or if it's too long so that the employee never even read it, then the employer is going to run into some issues.
Yeah, and I know you've seen these too, because I'll as we've gotten handbooks in to review, and they're like 200 pages, and they have everything under the sun in them.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody's gonna read them. They're just not. I mean, I think it's great for, to put it together and to have that information, and in a vacuum, but in reality, they're not gonna read it. So it's best just whatever's I shouldn't say the minimum, but whatever you have to have in the handbook to get your point and your information across, do it as little as you can, if that makes sense.
Just concisely, like
Yeah.
keep it clear and
That's not a
concise.
word. That's a
Yeah.
good word. That's
Well-
what we bring you on the podcast. And that lends itself to is so many companies, used to, it was, and I say this every podcast, so if anybody listens, they probably hear this all the time. So it's used to, if you had 20 employees, you were in one state. Now you have 20 employees, you may be in 15 states.
That's right.
And depending on where they are, if you're in the California, Oregon, Washington, the New Yorks, the Illinois, the Colorados, those kind of states that are very progressive, those policies grow, or those required policies. So stacking all of those in a handbook, we're talking about length, we can really grow those, right? And so what's your recommendation on how do we address that for these companies that are in so many different states?
What we always suggest is having a separate state addendum for each state in which the company operates, and that addendum is going to address those specific state policies. So just like you said, it sort of seems like when we see a company with 10 or 15 different states, for whatever reason, they are almost always in the more progressive states. And so they'll wind up with state addendums of hundreds of pages stacked on top of their 50-page employee handbook.
Yeah.
If you've got a separate state addendum for an employee that's in California, all they have to see is your base employee handbook and the California addendum. And now they're at just 65 pages instead of 300. And so it's, again, a lot less for the employee to sift through, and they can focus on what actually is applicable to them.
Yeah. And administratively, it's easier for the company too, because if you've got all these different states and you've got many employees in each state, if California is the only one that has a change, they're the only ones that you have to update and get the reauthorization. You don't have to go to all 100 employees, if you will.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
So that'll make it much, much easier. So as we're coming down to, we've got our handbook, we're kind of looking at the length and those things. What do you suggest from a review perspective? So timing and process and those things.
Well, we always suggest at least an annual review. So at the bare minimum, what I would suggest to any company is especially this time of year, because if there's going to be new legislation that goes into place, it typically is effective on January 1st.
Mm-hmm.
So in the fall, if you want to review your old policies and make sure that things, especially like your leave policies, your wage policies, overtime breaks, things like that, you'll want to make sure that those are updated going into the new year. And then it is important for employers to try their best to stay abreast of current employment topics, things that are happening and changing in their state legislature. Because if there is a big change, it may not wait until January 1st to go into effect. I know Colorado had a big family leave act that went into effect in September of last year. And so it would have been really important for Colorado employers to make sure their handbooks addressed the new state paid family leave that was effective in September versus January 1st.
Yeah.
So it's at least an annual review at the bare minimum, but as often as possible, try to stay up on the big legislative changes because you might need to go ahead and make those changes before the big handbook review.
Okay. No, that makes sense. And so what's the downside if they don't do the review or they don't have a handbook? Where's our risk there?
I think if they don't have a handbook, first of all, a lot of times managers, employees, they don't know what they don't know. So if the company is not setting forth their clear expectations on what they want their policies to be, and in some cases their procedures to be for certain items, then employees don't have those clear expectations. And, people in general like to know what's expected of them.
Okay.
It increases morale. It increases understanding across all boards. So that's the first thing. Secondly, if the company doesn't have clear policies in place for those things we mentioned earlier, like leave, overtime laws, even discrimination in some jurisdictions, then they can face pretty hefty fines if they weren't following the practices that the state has set forth, and then an employee were to file a complaint. So having the document that explains all of those things in one clear, concise space is best for everybody involved.
Yeah. No, and I think that makes sense. And it's and I get it. Again, it for a lot of times it's you're running your business, you got stuff going on every day, you got employee issues, you have all these things, and a lot of times that handbook gets shoved in a drawer and it's not maintained as it should.
Mm-hmm.
And I get that. And we talk to so many people that, well, it really hasn't been reviewed in 5 or 6 years or 10 years or whatever that is. And so I think that is so important to keep that up to date because an out of date handbook that to your point, that has the wrong policies, that's a risk. And so it's very important to keep that, to keep those updated.
Yep.
So we've talked about the handbook. So what else? Is there anything else that we kind of need to think about from a handbook perspective? We've kind of talked about things that are included, things not to include. Is there anything else that you'd like to end with?
I think it's just really important to maintain good morale with the employees. Like I just said, people like to be communicated with. They like to understand what's expected of them and understand where barriers and lines are. And so it's just one of my favorite ways for an employer to be able to say to their employees, we care about you enough to outline everything you need to know. And here it is in a nice little package document for you.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's a great tool. I really do. And I think it is important that it stays up to date. And so, well, great. Well, I really appreciate you joining us. I think it's a good topic. And I think you obviously, you do a lot of these and have a lot of knowledge. So I appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the MyHRBuzz podcast presented by MyHRConcierge. For more information on this topic and many others, please visit our blog at www.myhrbuzz.com. It's a free resource and has a lot of great information on HR and employee screening related topics. If you like the podcast, please do 3 things for us. 1, leave a review. 2, subscribe to the podcast. And 3, tell a friend. Our podcasts are available on iTunes, Spotify, and many other places where you get your favorite podcasts. If you'd like to provide ideas or feedback on future shows, send us an email at podcast@myhrbuzz.com, or you can reach us at 855-538-6947, extension 108. This is Chris Cooley with MyHRConcierge. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to sharing more topics with you in the future.